Oh, yeah. Good evening. Or afternoon. Or late afternoon, right?
Where are we? This is evening, I think.
It is evening.
This will count as evening. Well, Mick, as I mentioned, I had a chance to read the book and, of course, look through all of the photographs. I wonder if you could just describe, and we'll have a chance to see a bunch of them and to discuss them in some detail. But I wonder what it was like for you just going through all the material that went into creating something like this, because it's quite a story, and it documents a period that was incredibly important for you, incredibly important for your band, right, but also incredibly important culturally and incredibly important for millions of people. And what was it like just going through all that material and putting it together?
Well, it was mostly a thrill, and it was very, very revealing. And the old sort of slightly corny adage that every picture tells a story, because this is very much driven pictorially, and there is editorial and I hope stuff that makes good sense, trying to keep a story of what started the whole thing, known as Fleetwood Mac. And there were moments where I had a certain amount of an archive that had survived to some reasonable extent, not as much as I thought, to be quite blunt. Hence the lovely book company Genesis that put not only this book but many others that are, as you are well aware of, they're very beautifully done, and they also have uncanny methods of foraging for material, and some of which, of course, to some reasonably large degree, ended up supplementing what I had. And there were moments that were very personal, and yet this book, although presented by me, is very much about paying kudos as an observer, which is a slightly strange thing to be saying, considering I've been in the band since it started. But for that reason, I wanted to try and make sure that it wasn't an I-me, Mick thing. But there were those moments when I did indulge, if I might say, a little bit, that were really poignant. One of them, there's a couple of pictures that are just photographs, but they're photographs, and the IE would be that there are pictures of Peter Green, and the book is dedicated to Peter Green, who started the band Fleetwood Mac, and some people don't realize that. I was lucky enough to be at his side as the original member that helped Peter put this all together. And there was a picture or two in there on the last little mini tour we did in Europe, and we knew that he was leaving, and I remember on the tour bus looking at Peter, and there's a picture of him on the bus, and I remember distinctly going like, I wonder if there's just a chance he'll change his mind and not leave, and he did, and those moments were pregnant moments in terms of what's in this book, many of them for me, and of course historically there's a section in here which became really a reminder to me, and we were talking briefly backstage about the import is to pay attention to the story, which is not only the original four members, and very shortly after the inception of Fleetwood Mac, Danny Kerwin's, the five of us, is a whole slew of people came, including, of course, Bob Welch, all of which is in this story. But the band was a band that was formed the love of playing music, no doubt, but blues music these were our heroes, and it was a bunch of funny English guys that just would do anything to listen to music of our heroes, the masters, so many that I could reel off, dozens of people. What came to the fore in putting this book together was we found we were lucky enough to go to Chess Records and do Blues Jam at Chess with Willie Dixon, who put it all together with Mike Vernon, our little record company, Blue Horizon. But being reminded of that and finding, we found way more photographs that I'd never seen of us in the studio. And the reason it's so important for this book, probably almost the most important thing, is we were a blues band.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
You were reminding me, you saw us all those
Yeah,
years
I did
ago.
see that early version with Peter Green and Jeremy Spencer and Danny Kerwin out at the Action House on Long Island. I don't know if any of you remember that place. I may be the oldest person here. But it was 1970, and I went, because of Peter Green. I'd heard about him and heard him with the Blues Breakers, and knew that he had this new band together, and it was one of the most extraordinary shows I'd ever seen. Initially, even as a kid, I was thinking like 3 guitar players, but there was a sense each of those players had such a distinctive style, and everybody was just on. I was saying to Mick, the thing that I remember is nobody was just kind of feeling their way into a solo. It was like the second they started playing, they were on fire. And it was, I felt like I was pinned to the back wall of the club. My brain was blown open. It was quite an extraordinary thing. And I saw everybody back then. I was one of those kids who went to every single show. Wow. And that one was so distinctive, that I never forgot it.
I can tell. I'm a little dubious about what else you actually remember. Hopefully none of the hotel rooms.
It's a little bit fuzzier. Yeah, right.
That's amazing.
Well, let's start looking at some of the photographs and
sure.
Wander through. Now, who would that be?
This is where I break my neck. No.
Yeah.
Well, who is that cheeky guy? I actually don't know where that was taken, but I do remember the drum kit. And it's, as you can tell, it doesn't match. There's all sorts of, probably half of it's stolen or something awful. It's probably when I was in a band called the Shanes, which was before Fleetwood Mac. And it would have been in London, because I never had a drum kit that big at home, for sure. And wow.
And there you were again.
I hope there's some shots of some other people.
Yeah, we do.
Or the Narcissist.
There you are.
There you go. That's the Shanes, both shots with different members. And that was the first incarnation. The chap on this side is Peter Bardens, Peter Hollis on the floor, the bass man, and they are using and abusing my legs, as you can tell. And there's Eddie Lynch, who you can tell was a huge fan of Buddy Holly, and he really was, and he sort of looked like him. And that was the first official band, and Peter, as is revealed in the book, in some of the copy, Peter Bardens literally knocked on my sister's front door in Notting Hill Gate in a place called Horbury Mews, and he lived in the Mews, and it's a cul-de-sac. And he said, "I heard you playing drums in the garage," which is understandable. That's what I used to do. And he knocked on the door, and he said, "Well, I'm a manager," and of course he wasn't. And he did have a sort of worn-out mohair suit on, and he said, "I represent a band called not the Shanes, but the Senders." And he said, "Would you like?" I'd never played with any band in my life, but my whole dream of coming to London, which is explained in the book a little bit here, but Peter started my career, and I still know his daughter. I'm her godfather, and he's no longer with us, but that knock on the door is truly a rather important one. So I'm always very aware of paying homage to Peter.
What was it that drew you to drums?
Well,
what drew you to playing drums?
Oh, I don't know. I've often thought about that there was never any, like mum or dad, one of them was a musician or a part-time musician. There was the radiogram, and my mother was, if anything, was she did play violin when she was very young. I knew nothing about that, so that had nothing to do with it. Dad used to do this thing. He was in the Royal Air Force, which has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but if there was a little bit of money in his pocket, he would do, you know when you play spoons?
Sure.
And Dad played spoons a bit, and he would do this sort of military stuff. So that's about it. And then at parties he would play bottles or wine glasses with stuff. And I remember we were in Germany for some reason, and I crept. We were in some sort of pub, German pub, staying the night, and I was supposed to be in bed, and then I think Dad had the one or two, and he was doing his party piece on all these glasses. But no real reason apart from early on, whenever my mother would do the cleaning, she would put the BBC Home Service on, because we were often posted overseas. This particular memory would be from Norway, which is really, I suppose, where it started. And I started hitting furniture. Like when Mum would have the radiogram on, do the cleaning. She didn't smoke, but she used to have one little puff on a cigarette when she did the cleaning, and have a little glass of port, because neither my parents really, I had no memory that they were a couple of lushes and drank themselves into the ground, but it was sort of a ritual. But the radio would be on, and that's where I first remember doing this, and it sort of didn't stop.
Yeah, still hasn't stopped.
Well, that's a whole section which is hugely important, and I got to, it's not only there's Peter Green over here, there's John with me here, and I think that's up in Kluk's Kleek, a club. Looks like another stolen drum kit. And John met, the most important thing here is to mention, this is us working, I'm believing, with John Mayall. And when John, Peter, and myself were in the Blues Breakers, and anyone that's not aware of John Mayall's Blues Breakers, it spawned such a chunk of players, and I mean that by mainly all the fantastic guitar players, Eric and Mick Taylor, and of course Peter Green, and really quite a few more. Ainsley Dunbar, incredible drummer that I took his job for a short while.
It seemed like
I never really understood. That's a whole.
Oh yeah, Ainsley's drumming. Yeah, it's like a science.
But John Mayall it is really to be looked at as. I did this interview for the book, spent the afternoon with him. I said, how sort of amazing is that he's like a founding father, a mentor to the British blues scene.
It seemed like almost
Alexis
like a kind
Corner,
of college
Cyril
for,
Davis,
yeah.
John Mayall. These were people that sort of had the school. It was like the school of rock, you know.
Yeah.
And of course it is unbelievable how many people came through his band, and he's very active to this day, and we had a lot of fun, and a huge thank you to him, and he was always a huge fan of Peter Green's to this day, and was very conversant with all of his memories, and some of which are in the book, you know, about that. So that's us in John Mayall, and everyone always thinks that it was a sort of devious plot, that the three players in John Mayall, and I was with them for a short while, and got disengaged from my gigs. Me and John liked to drink, and John McVie, who's an incredibly talented musician, had been with John Mayall for many, many years. So one of us had to go, and there was definitely...
He had seniority.
And it was, oh yeah, for sure. There's a long-standing joke with me and John Mayall that I got my marching orders to to go and take a hike. But it's very often thought that the three of us thought of forming Fleetwood Mac while we were in John Mayall's Blues Breakers. It never was even, in fact, Peter, when he left John Mayall, he was wanting to go to Morocco like Brian Jones did, you know, and I think Eric went to Morocco, so he thought, well, I'll do what they. It was a thing.
Yes.
I'm going to Morocco and going to smoke the peace pipe for 6 months or something. And I don't think he ever made it there. And Eric came back from wherever, and Peter was by that point was still in John Mayall. This is before I joined, and he lost his gig because Eric came back. So there's a whole mishmash of things that happened, none of which ended up with anything like a conspiracy. Peter, when he finally left, really didn't want to do anything, and it was almost forced into, you got to form a band, and you got to do this, you got to, but people in the business, you know, and they persuaded him to form what turned out to be a phone call to me to be part of this band.
One of the really interesting parts of the book is your descriptions of Peter's personality, and the complicated relationship that he had with putting himself forward and with fame and any kind of kind of focus on himself beyond his playing. And I wonder if you could just talk about just him as a person and maybe him as a musician as well, and what it was like when you first met him and what you heard and felt about him.
I will try and stay on track, and feel free to cut me off because I tend to sort of go off at a tangent. But the first part of the conversation and answer would be, I have a confession. And the confession is that when Peter turned up to audition for a band that the other chap I told you, Peter Bardens, who gave me my first break, said, well, this guitar player I've heard is pretty good, and he's going to come and sit in and audition. And myself and Dave Ambrose, a fine bass player, went on to play with Brian Auger and a whole lot of great people. Peter Green came in with his chops down here, duffel coat, looking like a character from that film, The Gangs of New York or something. Like hardcore, just... and plugged in, and he had a Les Paul. In our world, we're going like, wow, he's got a Les Paul, and he did. Stolen, I'm sure. No, but no. And I made the app, considering that he's my favorite guitar player. I mean, because he comes from my past and where we all learned stuff. And myself and Dave Ambrose said, I don't think he's got enough ability. He only plays like a few notes. It was like the world's worst mistake that I could have ever, when I look back on it, because and Peter Bardens turned around and said, you're both wrong. This guy is so special, and he was the first time I heard the expression, less is more. And
yeah, he played like, the right notes, yeah.
Yeah, playing the right notes, and he very quickly, I turned like a rat around on myself and sort of went, but it was a terrible mistake, and one I actually remember and always like mentioning because I am such a huge advocate of what I learned from Peter and what Peter has, he started this band, Fleetwood Mac, and so he was very generous later on, which is a lesson which I think has had some residual results with what I learnt from, subconsciously probably, from Peter. If you think of Peter Green was looked at and adulated like Eric Clapton. Eric went in to form what was really one of the first super bands, was the Cream, which was like a Led Zeppelin. It was that they were the deal, and he was the deal. Peter didn't want that, and the first thing he did was name the band Fleetwood Mac. And the first album, it says Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. And he was so angry about that. And they slipped it in. I know why, because no one knew who we were, but some real purpose to the fact that Peter was on the circuit, was really well known, and was this up-and-coming guitar hero, you know, Green is God, and Eric's no good, and all this stuff. I mean, all this stuff was happening plastered over bus stops and things. Clapton is God, and then it was like, whoosh, Green is God, and it was a crazy scene with the blues fans, you know. But he gave straight away that, and he continued to do that. If you look at the first album, the album with the dog on the front, that album is hard. I mean, he's featured on it, but he so gave more than half of that to Jeremy Spencer. The point being, he was very, very, very generous, and was all about being in a band. So much so that I learned many years later, in a really bona fide interview, it said, well, to Peter, how did you, the name, you know, Fleetwood Mac? And he just, and I learned this ages and ages after the fact. He said, well, I always thought that at some point, I probably won't be in the band. I will have moved on, which of course he sadly did. And I want John and Mick still to have a band. This is
amazing.
Crucial, and there's more. I could go on a litany of stuff. And there's another major moment we might touch on, which just describes him as a person. Then play on the album. Danny Kerwin, young lad that used to come and sit in the front row and watch Peter. Half of that album is Danny. Boom. And that's what Fleetwood Mac has always been. People who have come through the ranks of Fleetwood Mac have always been accepted for their own worth as players. And as you are well aware, some very, very different from the band that we are spending time talking about, which is I have to say, is appropriate how it started. And I hope we touch on some of the other elements, especially Bob Welch and how Christine came into the band. But Peter was incredibly generous as a person and as a musician, and you can tell.
Well, you establish a kind of sensibility or a generosity, as you say, that really continued and has, you know, has made that band as a kind of institution just stay together and remain supple, you know, kind of accepting of new influences and new forces, and has survived and thrived in so many different ways.
Well, we can thank Peter and John and myself learning to do that, you know. There's John Mayall. That's probably still up in... we called them pubs. I mean, there were pubs with annexed rooms that became clubs. And that was our circuit, primarily. If we ever played like somewhere like this, we would think, oh my God, this is a stage.
A proper
here.
stage,
You know,
yeah, exactly.
You have to understand that our memory, and I'm getting off track, but in terms of turning up to places, I'm sure hundreds of dozens of places like that, where I remember the first time that I had an official gig, you know, like we were going to play a gig, you know, and we were getting paid in cheese sandwiches, you know, but it was like, and I got there so early because I had to set up the drum kit anyhow, and I remember going to say, well, where do you set up, you know? I was trying to do the right thing, and the guy behind the bar, you know, he's like mopping up, getting ready to open up for the night or something, and he just hardly even looked up, like, he said, over there, you know, over there, like, and I'm looking over there and going like, it's just the floor, right? And I said, you mean it's, because I thought, oh, but this is the big time, I'm playing, you know, and it was all about wherever you were told, and he said, no, over there where the carpet is, and it was like some old worn out carpet with some sellotape or tape that sort of, that's where you set up. And we learned very quickly to make the best of wherever you are, and dig in and, you know, and perform and do what you should do as a player to get over. But I was very soon put on track that it wasn't the big time straight away where I had visions of like, oh, there might be a stage. It's like Sunset Boulevard or something.
Yes, exactly.
I'm ready for my close-up. There you go. You can, for sure, you know the name of the band. John Mayall was a good marketer. Seriously, he knew his stuff, and I can tell that. And he had this incredible harmonica harness, and I'm believing that's it on the left, I think. But more importantly, that would be in a studio. I'm not quite sure where. That's probably from John Mayall's archive with young Peter, and you can tell like that the whole thing of that's pretty much how Peter looked in the early days. He looked a bit slightly more rugged when he walked in, and I thought he was useless. But that didn't. There you go. And he was such a had a vision, and when you say, because his whole life, as you know, changed to being completely like has no regard for what I know that he did, you know.
Yes.
Which is in itself a whole other story. But back in the day, he was very focused, and we came from very different worlds. I came from a totally different type of education, went to public school, which is privileged, to be quite blunt, and he came from the East End, from a Jewish background, and had quite a miserable childhood from all accounts. And I knew nothing of the sort. You know, I was blessed with. So we had this funny meeting place as friends from totally different worlds, and I was very always eternally grateful because Peter I was never that confident about, you know, playing the drums or something, and he said, enough of all that, you know, you play from the heart, and I'm going like, well, what's that, you know? And because he came from fighting to be who he was in his, and probably overly so, and that's why he, I think, was so attracted to blues music. And it sounds almost a little corny and self-serving, but he identified for sure with an avenue to get some of the pain that he felt as a young chap, and it's in there, and that's a really major thing, and he was a lot of fun, but you wouldn't want to mess with Peter Green, you know. If there were a couple of promoters that pretended that we weren't making the money, and Peter wouldn't, he would
sort them out.
He would sort them out, yeah. That's Jeremy Spencer. I think that for sure that's from Jeremy's archive, probably in Lichfield, where he has this looks like he's giving everyone the finger, but actually that's the slide on his guitar. He was and is one of the greatest slide players ever, and worshipped Elmore James, who was a great slide player, a great guitar player, but and worshipped Elmore James, and basically was Elmore incarnate, where he.
Well, when you went to Chicago, that.
Yeah, there's a picture in there with J.T. Brown, who was the saxophone player in Elmore's band. Elmore had passed away quite a few years before we went to Chess Records, and that was quite something. But he owned, you know, when you go to the theater and you go, yeah, it was pretty good, and then suddenly you go, it doesn't have to be someone who's, quote, famous, but just you go, you know you've been captivated, and you know that they're playing a part, but you actually forget that they're playing a part.
Yes.
That's when you know you've been grabbed literally by the you know what, and it transcends, because being in a way a copyist, but he wasn't. He was so into Elmore James that he
became Elmore
James, and he turned up in London, and he's tiny chap, and he always insisted on having these giant guitars that was one of them, but he used to have even bigger guitars than that. He turned up at Peter Green's home, which was in Putney, because Peter was still living with his family, and we all used to have duffel coats and Levi's and stuff, and he had this big old guitar, just one big old guitar in a case, and he opens it up and got all sorts of wires, sticky tape with pickups and stuff, and then, you know, later on that day he plugged that sucker in, and he was dynamite, total dynamite.
There was that great story, which touches on a little bit of that. But when you went to Chicago to make that album at Chess Records, and then years later, when Eric Clapton was touring, pretty recently with Andy Fairweather Lowe and his band, and and Clapton came over to you and said, "Listen, whatever you do, don't mention to Andy your album at Chess Records.
Right.
He makes us listen to it every night before we go on." And
that is absolutely true.
And that story is so great because, you know, I went back and listened to it, you know, to prepare to come and speak to you, and I was just reminded of how deep in you guys got. Like, you know, I think, you know, like when the Rolling Stones went to Chess Records, they made a Rolling Stones record, whereas you guys made, you know, like a blues record, like the way those guys made blues records, you know.
And with the guys.
And with the guys, that's right. No, we'll see some pictures in a minute, but...
No, that's brilliant. That actually is absolutely true. Eric said, no, don't start talking about, I have to listen to that album. Literally, and I did find out, because needless to say, Andy did talk about it. He said, no, we have it on in the dressing room. Eric comes into the band's dressing room just to warm up and say, okay, let's go, guys, we're on. And he has to walk into Fleetwood Mac every night and listen to Peter Green.
That is so funny.
That's Jeremy's band that he left to join and come to London. That was his band. That's the first gig we ever did at the Windsor Jazz Festival. And Bob Brunning, to mention, there's no John McVie there. That's me and Jeremy, as you can see, this little chap, this giant guitar, and Peter, with much deference, as you can tell, back. And Peter was not only a brilliant lead guitar player, but he really liked to dig in. We were talking about that too earlier, playing rhythm and complementing Jeremy, and mostly because Jeremy did most of the songs in those days. And Bob Brunning on the right was a bass player, fantastic chap, but knew that the band was called Fleetwood Mac, you know, and John McVie was playing the same show that day with John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and I sort of tongue-in-cheek do have, my explanation is that John McVie is got Scots blood in him, and I think for sure he wanted to make sure we had plenty of gigs before he actually left John Mayall.
So he'd get his pay packet.
So the irony was, at this gig, and Sweet Bob did a great job and hung in there until John McVie phoned up really a short while after. But we just played at City Field, and I mentioned that to someone else a couple of days ago, looking at this picture, And you're going like, this is the big time for us, right? This is not the carpet in the pub, and this is the first gig, you know. And we played in places before that in little bands around town, and we thought this was the biggest thing since sliced bread. And the PA system, which is a WEM system, was like the godfather of PA systems. And when you think about what it actually is compared to what we were using just 3 days ago.
Right.
And I go like, wow, how things have changed. But it was a great gig, and we were blessed that we had Peter Green, because believe me, we wouldn't have been on the big stage if it wasn't for him and his wonderful reputation that he had built up with John Mayall's Blues Breakers. But at that gig, John Mayall was playing. I think Eric was playing with Cream. A whole load.
Oh yeah, if you went through the, I think the whole lineup is in the book,
like,
and it's
unbelievable.
It's like a little index of every important blues-oriented band at that
13th of
time.
August, 1967.
Yeah, almost to the day.
And Christine McVie, and I mention this because why we may not come back to one of these pictures from Windsor Jazz Festival, I don't know. But Christine McVie was in a band called Chicken Shack, and she was playing in The Tent, and where we would have been if it hadn't been for Peter, I'm sure. And unbeknownst, this whole tie-in of this particular day, when you think about it, the movement of what was going on, John was there but wasn't in the band yet. Christine, who he married, was playing in a tent, had never, to my knowledge, met any of us. Andy, the bass player, Andy Sylvester, became one of my dearest friends and remains so, as with Christine. They're in this tent playing with Chicken Shack. We'd heard about Chicken Shack from up north. And then Chris used to come with Andy to our shows, as many as they could, because they loved the band and loved Peter. And this whole, and then eventually she joins Fleetwood Mac. She's already married to John, the bass player. And how wild is that?
I know. Absolutely.
It's almost, if you wrote it, you go, it's not true, which is...
No, it would seem too contrived. Absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's Johnny Mac with John Mayall, and I think that on drums is actually Keith Hartley. So that's from John's archive with a nice picture of John McVie. And while I'm on the story, if you look at the bass, which is a Fender Jazz, I think, or Precision, it's quite a hefty instrument. And when I first took over, not from Keith Hartley, but from Ainsley Dunbar, and everyone was hero worshipped in John Mayall's band. There'd be followers like, go on, you know, Keith, go on, you know. No one had heard of me. So when I took over from Ainsley, who is an absolute genius drummer, you know, genius. And I go, and they said, well, we want someone that just plays simple stuff. So fair enough. Ainsley, somewhat, I was befuddled why he was losing his gig. But he had this following. And I remember, not at this gig, but that particular guitar, or one very like it, I'm sure that's the one, is that I got heckled at the first show I did with John Mayall. And I'm like, where's Ainsley? Like, come on, where's he? He's useless, you know, or whatever. Like, he doesn't even do a drum solo. And which I didn't. I still don't really, but... and John, right there, and I knew John a little bit. We used to play the circuit when I used to go and see these guys. And John, very rarely, if you've ever seen documentaries or films on Fleetwood Mac, I doubt you ever see John McVie coming up to the microphone, ever. He plays bass, and that's the way he likes it. Well, this particular time, when I was dying, I'm going like, literally wanted to dissolve into the stage. He comes up with, it's sort of held much like that, but higher. Like, I've got something in my hand, and I'm going to wrap it around your head if you don't shut the you-know-what up. And he said, give this guy a chance, you know, and made the speech. everyone went quiet, and I got through the night. And I never forget that.
That's amazing.
That's a true buddy.
Yeah, for sure. Whoops.
That's it. We've been hit over the head.
Ah.
That's more from...
Well, there's your big crowd at
wow.
Windsor.
Look at the big stage there. But that's early days, just endless photo sessions in London. And I hope one day you might put up what was... God, I remember that. I still got that ring, the eyeball. I got my eye on you.
Oh, what's happening here? Oops.
These I'm thinking, no, they're not the first shots, because Danny's already in the band. And as with Jeremy, when Danny came in, Danny Kerwin here, Peter was so generous, and took him under his wing, and they played. It was the beginning of, again, what we touched on, those 3 guitar players when you walked into that club that got hit over the head by 3 of them.
Exactly.
And that's the big 3 there, which was very unusual in a band. You often had, maybe a couple of rhythm guitar players, then you have the lead player. They all worked in duality, and we became 3 bands in one, really, in many ways.
Yes, exactly.
That many years later, and some of the journey in between, became almost part of the lineage of the history of Fleetwood Mac. If you look at the fact that Stevie and Christine and Lindsay are all stylistically very different, and all of these guys played very, very different approaches to their guitar playing, and Jeremy very much so. I'm thinking that could be at Chess Records. I'm not sure without looking at some of the stuff. And that would be from Danny's, I would say that that's Danny not in Fleetwood Mac, in a band called the Boiler House. And I mean, he was literally like 15 years old.
Looks 15 years old. Yeah.
Yeah. You notice the harmonica, and in those days, and that's how when you can't, you put your head right on the guitar. These days you have tuners on phones, and you're told where it is. But we were huge sticklers for tuning, which is intonation, which is, for anyone out there who's a musician, I don't play, I mess around on guitar, but I'm around that, and which is about being in tune and being in pitch. And with Peter was known, as was Danny, all of them, with bending a note, but keeping it in pitch. There were many, in those days, everyone would say, well, I play blues. You go like, not really. Well, I've got a Marshall amp and it goes to, 13, or, like Spinal Tap. But not really. It's all about touch. And the first thing to learn, which was hugely important, was to be in tune. And it's so often through the years, not by the band that I've been in, gets forgotten. And it also gets forgotten if you bend a note, you have to know when to stop, or you bend it in and then out of tune. Peter would have had a harmonica to check the note, and then done the rest by ear religiously. And we would not play out of tune. And I've been with other players where, for whatever reason, we would call, when I say we, the original Fleetwood Mac would say, that's not acceptable, that's not okay. And you have to have the discipline to be in tune, which was quite revealing about there was a form of real discipline and dedication to starting off with a band that was in tune. And he insisted on it, and John McVie, to this day, would say, stop, at a sound check, now, not in tune.
Wow.
That's me and Pete. That's at chess. Mike Vernon on the left in the striped T-shirt. And that was Chess Records. I think that's Buddy Guy on the right.
I was about to say, is that Buddy Guy? Wow.
I think so. And Jeremy in the back. You can see that the guitars are getting bigger. And
oops, sorry. Should we go back, or do you want to?
No, I'm just going to make a comedic comment. I still have my balls. This is such a great shot to me, not of this thing here on the drums, but all of that going on in the background. And you have to remember what that meant to this funny bunch of English lads being in the church. Chess Records, as you well know, and anyone, happily I'm believing it's still there and is being kept as a shrine of sorts. But to be in the studio, but then to be in the studio with a lot of, God knows we knew who they were, and Willie Dixon put all this together with Mike Vernon, and it was something else. And I had somewhat forgotten what that, briefly before we get on to that, what that meant. And that's why we were talking earlier about, that really tells the story about a lot of guys and girls, understandably, would not know that that's where we started, because the enormity of the band that exists in the here and now and for the last 40 years, understandably, that's going to be the incarnation that correctly so will be remembered in the proportion that it is going to be remembered in. But this is a nice thing to be sitting here. First of all, someone actually saw the band play, and those sessions were hugely important to us as young players. This is, I would say, is the Fillmore. Grateful Dead?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's me on acid, I think.
You all got dosed,
I gave
right?
up playing drums. I took to dancing. And
Okay.
And just recently, I did a benefit with Phil, the guitar player in Grateful Dead, and he remembered that night.
No.
I couldn't believe it. He never saw the picture or nothing. And he was just reminiscing. He said, because we played several times with the Grateful Dead, and in truth, it's no secret that they were stoned all the time. and the worst damage we'd ever done was a pint of beer and a puff on an occasional joint. But they'd heard about Peter, for sure, and they met us two of them met us at the airport. I still don't know. It's like these photographers that turn up at the airport. You go, how do you know we even arrived? That happened today a few times, more than a few times. And there's some network, and they had found out that we were coming through proper channels or whatever, and they were there at the airport. And we had never heard of the Grateful Dead. We didn't know who the hell they were. and we were, nobody believed me. In England, we happily had a really successful beginning, but no one knew who the hell we were, so it wasn't about that. We just didn't know who they were. And we realized that they owned California, they owned Haight-Ashbury, and boy did we go into the den, like there's like little English boys going like, and Owsley, their road manager, is world famous for the good and the bad of it, which is a whole other story, but it was definitely capturing these helpless young English chaps and showing us into a world that was back there was one of the stories of our endless Grateful Dead jams that ended up with mostly me dancing all the time. But that's at the Albert Hall with a tour we did when like I said, we were blessed with instant, really, success at what for us was a very grand level. I mean, real success, and a blues album being in the charts where really is supposed to be playing pop music, and everyone thought this young band had invented something brand new, and really it was us copying our masters. But that would be one of our masters, and we were, you know, the Cat's Whiskers in England, and Peter said, well, we're going on a tour, and Peter, I remember he said, I will absolutely not have it. B.B. King's going to be headlining. And we opened up for B.B. King and had him. The Stones have done a lot of great stuff that happens to be similar. Had Solomon Burke on great shows and insisted that great people have been playing on some of those early TV shows.
Yeah, Howlin' Wolf on Shindig.
Yeah, and no one knew who Howlin' Wolf was, and they go, no, this is, and that was our version in many ways. And BB still remembers that tour. Sadly, he's not that long gone, but he's passed on, and it's always very obscure. He loved Peter Green, and remembered everything. Would always, whenever I'd see him, he would mention about the music. And then, strangely enough, BB was partial to enjoying a good meal, and when the first time, but he never stopped saying it. Through all the years, he would repeat this story. He said, I remember being in a hotel, going back to the hotel in like Leicester or wherever it was, or Nottingham, and he had it right. And I said, yeah, I remember that. And he said, I always remember eating those cucumber sandwiches and a pint of beer after the gig.
That's fantastic.
He had huge reverence, and you can imagine how much that meant. And in the early days, when I knew nothing really in any great detail, and I mean way back, before we were blessed with knowing or meeting or even playing, and we got to play many of the nights we jammed during that tour around Europe, again, which gets forgotten even by us bunch, you know. And B.B. King was such he always remembered Peter's touch.
Wow.
Peter's touch, and he would talk about it with reverence to a lot of great players, English players that came out, that he's such the guy. And then there was the whole side of B.B. King, which many of you must know about, is that he was, when they talk about him being a gentleman, he was truly a gentleman, and always had good graces, and would never go to the side. He was just so happy that a lot of these funny little English guys had, in a way, brought back a form of music that, in some great respects, and somewhat unbelievably, had been passed by the very country that it grew up in.
That's exactly right.
The United States. And we, the Stones, for instance, and many of these funny English bands, it is true. The irony brought it back. And BB always would mention that because sometimes, and understandably, there was some bitterness about who's doing what and how some of these players ended up feeling about an art form that was maybe not acknowledged, quite frankly, in their own country. And that was always a reminder of that. He spoke to it always. I saw very recent interviews, and he always said, you know what, how great was that it helped people in my world survive. And he really was B.B. King, a master and a fun guy. And it was a privilege to play with him. That, I'm not sure. Peter, Danny on the right, and that would be, it might,
Oh,
I wish I had some of the titles up. That's Peter on 6-string bass, and
Well, this is intriguing. That now,
I think Peter is, yeah.
this is where Peter is beginning to make his transition out of the band. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I was struck in the book when you mentioned, when he would just begin showing up in what you describe as his Jesus clothes, and the sense of at first, look, it was a kind of time where people might do something like that, and in the way that in any band that stays together for any length of time, people are given a certain amount of space to do whatever they like as long as they're there to do their show.
Right.
But he eventually, both he and Jeremy, and separately but dramatically, left the band, and I mean that had to just be completely devastating.
Well, it was, and it's not spoken to in any great detail, because this is, for me, is about the music and what we did, but that is absolutely the case. It was very, very dramatic, and a lot of it ended up being confusing and something that still is what if, and for me, and certainly speaking, if I might, for John a little bit, John McVie, is that part of you goes, I wished I'd known what to do. That might have. You question that, and it's very debatable, really, whether some of that journey would have taken place or not. But it did start to get. Peter was reaching out. If you listen to many of his songs, like "Man of the World," it is a very poignant song, and if you know, again, which is not what this is all about, but I'm happy to touch on it, was that he was crying out and drowning, and we didn't know how to throw a rope, or even that a rope needed throwing out, which is always befuddles me as a person.
Well, so much was going on at that time. It was, I think, very difficult really even to identify it. And these things, if things were going to be any different, has been plenty of time for them to have become different, but
I know.
For the most part, they've kind of stayed the same. There was Peter wrote a couple of pages in the book, which was quite moving, I thought.
Yeah.
His statement, and Jeremy's as well.
No, the whole thing is, the title is one of, really, when you hear it, the song, Love That Burns, it floors me every time, and not only the timbre of his voice and what he happens to be singing about it's so him, and his guitar playing is beyond delicate and beautiful. But it became that, and just part of when I did the interview, and I don't think I mentioned it, it is so about what you've just come round a little bit of a full circle about Peter, is when I did that interview, when I say interview, conversation, and I said I'm running a tape, and we spoke for about 3 hours, and I said I just want, and we put some of the conversation into this lovely book. But one of the things that totally floored me, I thought, well, I had a few questions I thought, oh, I'm going to actually ask him, And one of them was, I wanted to know, why did you ask me to play next to you in the band, meaning pick me? He had a couple of other people that I found out, that one was an old friend of his, Dave Bidwell, who actually ended up playing with Chicken Shack with Christine. And I probably thought, well, Mick, I thought you were a pretty good drummer, like something that,
sure, right, of course.
Maybe, and I wasn't fishing for that.
No.
And he instantly just went, I said, why was that? He said, because you were sad. And I took a breath, and I'm going like, where's this going? And he said, don't you remember? And he said, you'd just broken up with Jenny. who I later married, mother of two of my eldest daughters. And I went, he said, yeah, you needed something to do. And you were so unhappy that you needed that.
That's extraordinary.
And if you stop to think about it, that has so much value as a friend. It floored me. My nephew, who helped me put the book together, who's here tonight, Kel's Jess, he phoned and said, how did it go? Because we're working on the book over the last couple of years. And I will confess, I couldn't actually talk. I actually just burst into tears. I said, I'm so moved by that's Peter Green. It's like that. And he was very, very generous and loving and caring, which way you want to describe it. So that's, after that interview, that's what happened.
Amazing.
No, it is pretty extraordinary.
Well, I wonder if you have anything to say about these characters.
And then he added, like, a useless drummer. Look at that, yeah. John and Chris, who would have known?
Really?
Yeah. And they're still dear, dear, dear friends. You know, that's Kiln House. That's the Kiln House period, which is after Peter left. That's me and Jenny at Kiln House. I've still got that car. That's in Hawaii.
Don't have the girl, I have the car though.
Lettuce leaf. It was blue then, but now it's green.
Wonder if you have a Beatles story from your days around that time when obviously, Jenny's sister was involved with George, and
probably.
Yeah, I just wonder, was there a particular moment that you just to kind of evoke, the
the
band
times,
of that time,
which is sort of the backdrop to this period, which is certainly there are no pictures of the Beatles in there, but just being by default or whatever it's called, George was my brother-in-law for many, many years, and Patty and George were married, and Jenny, I think we got married at Kiln House.
Oops.
There's Bob. But, and George and Patty came to the wedding and so forth. But one of the things I was reminded of in terms of trying to describe what was going on, in the early days, even before Fleetwood Mac was formed, we were around this thing called the Beatles, and I remember going to Abbey Road and actually being in the studio by just happened to be happening. And I think it was Paul, that is Maxwell's silver hammer, comes down across his head, and he's actually hitting a real anvil, which is how they put the shoes on the horse, and beat the hell out of the horseshoe. And there he is, whacking away at this thing, which is on the record. And it's just like moments like that are relevant, mostly when you look back, because we came from a different world. And one of the most lovely things that ever happened to this original band, Fleetwood Mac, we were coming back, and Peter had written a song called Albatross, which is an instrumental, a very floaty, haunting instrumental. And they had obviously heard it. And we were coming back from a gig, and it was actually a godforsaken hour in the morning, coming into London. I think we fell asleep at the side of the road and then decided to finish off the journey. As we're coming into London, early in the morning, John, whether it was a recording or not, I don't know, but they were on the radio introducing tracks off one of their albums, and I think it was Sun King.
Oh yeah, Abbey Road, yeah.
Abbey Road,
yeah.
And John Lennon says, and we had the radio on, And he said, yeah, this is where we're doing our Fleetwood Mac thing. And that's for a little, you know, in our
Sure.
world, we were doing okay, but we certainly weren't anywhere in it. But to hear that was going like, wow, bloody hell. and I found out much later in time that when John Lennon put what was the band called? The White Elephant?
Oh, with Elephant's Memory?
Elephant's
Yeah.
Memory. Yeah. That I believe Eric ended up playing up in Canada or something.
Yeah, yeah.
I think. Peter apparently was his first choice, and I don't know why Peter didn't do it. He should have, or what happened. But he had definitely a high regard for Peter, as most and all guitar players from any style. Peter had an incredible, and if you know Peter even back then, he was really very humble, and then increasingly became so much so that, you know, when he picks this book up, he'll probably go, yeah, it's good, but he won't be going, he doesn't know what he did.
Flip, 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 where am I?
Yeah.
Yeah, or just like, yeah, the way everyone else does.
But I do.
Yeah, I certainly do.
This Bob
Well,
Welch.
this was a dramatic transition.
Yeah. Sadly not with us anymore, but Bob and that period with Bare Trees, Future Games, Mystery to Me, they're about 4 or 5.
Exactly.
I mean, Heroes Are Hard to Find was his last album. Then he went on to a very successful solo career for quite some time, and totally different. This is a real example of lesson learned coming full circle in mine and ostensibly John's world, where Bob was a very, very different style of guitar playing and songwriting, and from where he came from. He came from sort of an R&B, jazz type of background, and wrote all these very esoteric, floaty songs like Hypnotized and Bermuda Triangle. Just by the titles themselves, they demonstrate he was way out there in his thinking, and really was very knowledgeable about, if you wanted to talk about flying saucers, you would talk to and he wrote, of course, Sentimental Lady, and which later on we re-released. And when he was a solo artist, they had a big hit with it, and Stevie and Lindsay and Chris sang on it with him. And a great guy, absolutely fantastic guy, and a huge, huge kudos, hats off to that period that very much gets even more forgotten about than
Yeah, because there's a kind
section.
of purist, interest in those early days, though everything that's documented here, still if you go online,
Right.
Like 40 years later, people are like, I don't ever know why they gave up the blues. They're sure they've had some success, but they were when they were doing it, blah blah blah. Like there are people who are just still holding on to that, and and then obviously all of the tremendous kind of impact and success and phenomenal records, and that the kind of current sort
you
of
mean
classic
that?
lineup.
That?
Yeah, that has its own standing, but there's that interim period that just gets overlooked. But like God, you did a lot of work and a lot of good work, and
Yeah.
and it's nicely documented here.
No, it is, and without that period, that's Bob Weston, great guitar player, came into Fleetwood Mac from Long John Baldry, who was basically like a creative godfather to Rod Stewart, and a great advocate, vocalist, blues singer, Long John Baldry. And Bob played with Baldry on one of our early tours, and then Jump Boat. And he was on Mystery to Me, and that's at a house we all lived in called Bennyfolds, which was an extension of, that's the last shot. That's the restaurant, which is still there, El Carmen. Full circle, not that long ago, we decided to to go back to where, which is not at all featured in here, apart from that's where I introduced, in that restaurant, introduced John and Christine to Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. And without an audition, they'd heard the Buckingham Nicks album, and almost unbelievably, or maybe on the face of it, even almost stupid, but we loved the music so much that we didn't play a note. They might have been like Milli Vanilli or something. What if they actually, it wasn't them? No. But it was, and that's where we had dinner. And the only slight hint of anything, Christine, who's a real band member, like she's a player, and she said to me and John they'd fallen in love with the music that I'd heard, and we made the decision that nothing was going to stop it. But Chris did say, she said, let's just say, let's meet, because there's nothing worse than two women that don't get along. And in-laws and all these stories that maybe some of you can even, in a humorous way think of. And they got on like a house on fire because they're so different. And Chris is so much of a band player that she was already welcoming and she'd heard the harmonies in these two magical voices that came into a whole another story that's not in this book for sure. But that's where it started.
But this is only volume 1.
Well, yeah. We hope so one day.
We I just want to run just a couple of questions quickly from the audience. There's any ideas why classic American blues hit home so deeply with British musicians in the late 50s and early 60s? What was it, do you think, that...
Yeah, I think it might have something to do with, coming out of the god-awful war and a lot of energy that just generally said no more of that, in a subconscious type of way, and people wanting to express feelings, and music is doubtless almost one of the most, if not the most, quietly powerful ways that transcends everything. Art, for sure, when you look at it, does the same thing. Writing very often can be, but is sometimes specific to certain cultures, and music tends to blow some of those walls down. And I think that was part of why we were all nuts for everything. When you hear interviews about the Beatles and what they were hearing, and music that came through American GIs that was played in Europe, because half of Europe was, and still is, with massive military bases all over the place, and music on a channel called Radio Luxembourg, you heard blues and early rock and roll stuff, because the guys in the forces would enjoy that, and some of that came from there, and some of it came on the merchant ships during the war. And after the war, when there's huge amounts of American music, and some of it was for sure R&B and blues slipped in. And then it became just something that the culture was ripe for the picking. And I'm never quite sure what it was, but I've heard interviews, they all seem to, some of the players that came from those days in my world, Eric and Jimmy Page and guitar players and other artists, and they all seemed to sort of say we were sort of ready for something that was going to be ours and not saccharine and not sweet. And I think blues, just the very nature of the word blues, which to me any genre of music can be blue. And it's not, you don't have to be, from the Delta, playing Delta blues to be playing blues. But it was the flagship, and it was a way of saying something that you needed to say, and sometimes, God knows, back in the day, that those folks weren't allowed freely to express themselves, and they went to church, and I mean that with music, and that appealed to a sensibility of a lot of young folk, certainly in this strange little country, England, latched onto that, and it just became something that they really didn't let go of. In my world, it's not, and again, there was all sorts of music that came out of England, we know that, but that's why I think it seemed to have happened, and certainly why it appealed to Peter, as I mentioned earlier on in our lovely talk, was he was ripe for the picking, that music was an expression of being free and yet being held back by certain feelings that he couldn't get out unless he found a vehicle to shout it through. And blues, the fundamentals of blues music was something that just flicked that switch and set him free for a while.
And this it's kind of a maybe whimsical question, an alternative universe question here. Looking back, if you hadn't had this career, what would you have liked to be?
I would have liked to have, well, I didn't want to be, but I think, if I could have flicked a switch, I would have liked to have been an actor.
Ah, that works.
And I say that because one of my elder sisters was a very fine actress, and Susan, and I was blessed with being around that world. And remember, if I hadn't played drums, really what I'm confessing to is God knows what I would have done. So I can't add up, I can't read very well, and I'm not kidding. And it so appealed to me because I'm seeing her working in the early days as a student, and then I thought, well, at least I could sweep the floor or something backstage, or I'm so lucky that I became, this. And it did appeal to me what I saw Susan doing, but I don't think I would have had the discipline to have done it. So I really lucked out that I found something because I needed to express myself too, and Peter, in his magical way, taught me that you're doing that. First of all, you don't know what you're doing, which is actually good, because you're in the moment, and you're vulnerable, and you're gonna have to grab hold of what's going on and go with it, and not have too many preconceived things. It was for him to have, and I'm not kidding, that's sort of what he told me, that it's okay what you're doing. You don't need to be that clever, like doing all this stuff. I've learned to do some of that along the way, but...
But your sense of time, I think, was always the thing that I responded to, certainly in that, throughout, but like in that early stuff where, you've got these guys who are leaping off, like somebody's got to hold down the fort and just be right there. And I think, that, and, obviously John too, but, that seems to me to be your gift. it's that solidity, and the regularity. It's just like, go where you want to go, we're going to be right here,
Yeah, and it works because I actually couldn't go anywhere else.
Well, you make a virtue out of these things. Well, Mick, we're very lucky. We're very lucky that you lucked out and decided to be a drummer in a band. And this was such a great pleasure. And those of you, would like to join Mick for the meet and greet for the book, and get your, sign up for your signed copy. Please stick around. But let's all just show some appreciation for Mick Fleetwood.